What if I told you that a base set Unlimited Charizard in near mint-to-mint condition sells for significantly more in a PSA slab than the same grade with its competitors, CGC or BGS? However, if we took a modern card like the Umbreon from Evolving Skies in the top grade offered by these three competing companies, the BGS Black Label 10 outsells the PSA 10 by over 400%. In an era of rapidly changing market dynamics, knowing how to assess condition and where to grade your cards has never been more important. Today, I invite you to join me as we attempt to demystify card grading here in 2024. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. It's 2024, and a lot has changed over the last few years when it comes to grading cards. Now, in this video, I wanted to start by talking about some of the updates pertaining to the big three grading companies, PSA, CGC, and BGS. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the optimization process of determining which company to send cards to. And finally, we'll explore which cards to send to get graded in the first place, because ultimately, there is a bit of a cost-benefit analysis that needs to happen when making that decision. Anyway, guys, let's roll into it. First, let's talk about grading prices. Now, back during the pandemic, companies like PSA shuttered their doors and made grading inaccessible to the masses. However, since then, over the last year or so, prices have normalized. We're seeing more competition in the graded market space. Currently, PSA charges $14.99 per card if using their bulk service, CGC only charges $11 per card, and BGS is charging $14.95. Now, you can actually get better prices than these because PSA is offering specials every month to their members, and I've seen them go as low as $12.99. Meanwhile, CGC has an elite tier through a subscription service that's offering $8.80 per card. So it's a fairly competitive market, and I think this is opening the door for a lot of prospective collectors and would-be graders out there. And speaking of accessibility, there's been a number of new opportunities for people that traditionally haven't been sending their cards in for grading on their own. Recently, PSA announced a partnership with GameStop where individuals can submit their cards through GameStop, and that's only for $1 more. They're only charging $14.99 per card with no minimum, and it's advertised as a 45-day turnaround. Similarly, CGC also has an expedited service through Fanatics. You send raw cards into Fanatics, they have people on staff that are able to turn around cards at just $9 per card, and they're hoping to get that service down to just 24 hours as a turnaround time, though I've been told it's closer to about 3 days. Either way, this makes grading so much more accessible to the masses, particularly for people that have never graded before, or maybe are a little bit intimidated to do so, removing that barrier of entry. Of course, this begs the question, which grading company should you be sending your cards to? Now, this is a highly subjective question with a number of different factors at work, but generally, I look at it in these three factors. When it comes to market share and the majority of collectors, they're PSA collectors, so liquidity and resale value is often more closely attached and aligned to PSA. Especially for those cards that are in that near mint to mint range, the 8s, the 9s, this is the direction I would urge people to go. On the other hand, CGC has the lowest cost point to entry and the quickest turnaround time, and those can both be very attractive to resellers and collectors as well. Finally, Beckett is the only one of these companies that offers subgrades, so there's an element of transparency there. It's also a very thick and premium feeling slab. Also, the Black Label Premium really can't be beat, but we'll get to that a bit more here in a little bit. Regardless of which one of these companies you personally prefer, condition is everything. Now, I've made a whole video breaking down conditions and the grading guidelines for PSA with detailed examples and pictures of each one, so if that's something you're interested in learning more about, I'll leave a link to the video down in the description below. As I alluded to earlier, every one of these grading companies applies their grading scale slightly differently, but one thing that they all have in common is they all take those 4 grading criteria, averages them out, and then applies one singular numeric score for a grade. PSA probably has the simplest grading scale, and although PSA does offer half-point grades, they're seldom used and so are not really worth considering. On the other hand, we have Beckett, which offers 2 different BGS 10s, a Black Label 10 and a pristine Gold Label 10, and they consider Gem Mint their 9.5. Finally, we have CGC, which also has 2 10s, a pristine Gold Label 10, and then a 10 Gem Mint, and CGC makes extensive use of the 0.5 grades, and in that way, it's perhaps the more nuanced and complex of the 3 grading systems. Now, a quick disclaimer, but in my own personal experience, when mixing these grades together and categorizing them, I often think of them in terms of tiers, and at the very top of Mount Everest, in its own tier, would be the BGS 10 Black Label Pristine grade. These are supposed to be absolutely flawless, and they're incredibly scarce on the market, and thus command a very high premium. My next category would be in green, and these are cards I would consider gem mint, and often these ones have similar price point, as well as populations and conditions. In the yellow are cards that I would consider mint, and these ones are virtually flawless, but maybe they exhibit some small flaw like slightly off-centered or a dot or two of edge wear on the backside. Then finally, in red, are cards that I would consider near mint. Now this is perhaps the hot take of this categorization system, but I would actually consider a lot of PSA 6s and 7s to be the standard conditional equivalent of the 8s from the other two grading companies. You guys can come at me in the comments, but that's just my experience. So to look at it another way, as a continuum, this is how I would personally break it down, with the BGS 10 Black Label Pristine all the way on one end, and then working our way through all the different categorizations of mint, and then ending at the near mint to mint PSA 8. Anything below that, I would consider below a near mint to mint grade. Of course, it is worth noting that as we work our way through the upper echelons of mint condition, that the differences become so negligible that at some times, the difference between one grade and another are indistinguishable. And I think it's important that we also take these other two factors into consideration, the first being that there are huge fluctuations in gem rates between vintage cards and modern cards. They're just built differently and come with different conditional issues in their print production. Having said that, even within certain eras of Pokemon, there are still different quality issues. We might take a look at print lines being something that PSA often hammers more harshly than CGC does, and you see that reflected in the population reports of many of the Neo-era cards that are particularly susceptible to print lines. On the other hand, we could take a look at something like the Jungle set, which was very notable for chipping on the front edges, and that's something that PSA doesn't penalize as heavily as CGC does. You'll see that in the population reports as well. By the way, if you're interested in comparing gem rates between PSA and CGC and how each company prioritizes conditional issues, check out this video where I run through all of the data from base set through Neo Destiny. It's pretty fascinating to consider. Let's take a look at a pair of case studies, a modern card, the Moonbryon from Evolving Skies, and the unlimited base set Charizard, a vintage card. When comparing the top grade available from each grading company, you'll notice that the BGS Black Label 10 absolutely blows the competitors out of the water, earning over 400% the value of the PSA 10. Now, the PSA 10 sold for $1,400, and that's a really good price for a modern card, especially one that has this high of a population. But the BGS 10 sold for $7,621. Now, CGC's top grade, the Pristine 10, also outpaced the PSA 10 at $1,750, which is exactly 25% more than the PSA 10. Now, interestingly, these aren't the only grades that outsold the PSA 10. The BGS 10 Pristine Gold label also sold for a bit more at $1,575, and the CGC 10 came in a little bit under the PSA 10 at $1,128. So you can already see how this continuum that I showcased earlier is playing out when it comes to that modern Moonbryon from Evolving Skies. Now, to be fair, these were all individual listings that sold recently, but when scraping data from the last few months and taking overall averages, this is what the categories end up looking like. And you can see how the four tiers end up emerging organically, with the BGS Black Label 10 Pristine selling for $7,500 to $9,000. It really is in a whole world all of its own. Then in the green, we have what I would consider the Gem Mint copies selling for a bit over $1,000 and for as much as $2,000 in that CGC 10 Pristine and BGS 10 Pristine as well, the gold label one. As we work our way down though, one of the interesting things to note is that the PSA 6 and 7 seems to be about comparable price to the CGC and BGS 8s. Of course though, this is just a modern example. We'll turn our attention over to something vintage. Now the base set Unlimited Charizard is an interesting one to consider because it's one of the most desirable and recognizable cards in vintage collecting. In a PSA 10 it sold for between $9,000 and $11,000, and there really is no premium there for CGC 10s, even in the CGC 10 Pristine. A copy was sold in 2024 for $9,600, which is about comparable price to the PSA 10 copies. Now BGS is an interesting story because there are so few copies available in BGS 10 that I have really no idea how to accurately assess it. In fact, I couldn't find a single sale for the BGS 10 Black Label, and when it comes to the Pristine Gold Label, there was only one sale I could find, and that was from 2017, and it sold for $4,863. Now keep in mind, this was long before the pandemic boom, when vintage cards and Pokemon as a whole exploded, so I would have to think that either version of that card in BGS 10 would sell for significantly more than the PSA 10 copy does. Another thing that I think is interesting is that the CGC 10 Gem Mint grade and the BGS 9.5 Gem Mint grade both fall off incredibly hard when compared to the PSA 10. Now, I think there's a couple reasons for this. The first being that PSA is widely collected and more established within the vintage market, and Charizard has a very low gem rate, especially compared to the Umbreon from Evolving Skies that we just looked at. The Charizard is much more scarce. For example, Charizard has a 6% gem rate, meaning there's only 464 Gem Mint copies out of 51,271 copies graded. Compare that to the Umbreon that has an 81% Gem Mint rating with 8,536 copies available out of 11,197 copies graded. It's a pretty big difference. Just for fun, I also looked up the gem rate of the CGC 10 Gem Mint card, and that's at 18% with 213 copies available out of 11,563 cards graded. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the preference of the buyer pool combined with the total amount of copies available, or its scarcity, has a tremendous impact on the cost of the card. The other thing that I think is interesting is that copies that are near mint to mint sell significantly better in PSA than they do in respective slabs. The PSA 8 sold recently for $650 at auction. Meanwhile, a CGC 8 copy sold for $404, which is only 62% of the PSA price. Also, the BGS was also recently sold for 66% of the price, or $430. So there is a bit of an advantage there, especially for those near mint plus cards, to go with PSA. So here's what I might recommend for allocating your cards. If you have a modern card that is a particularly strong Gem Mint candidate, you might be willing to play the BGS lottery going for that Black Label grade. Now, it is highly unlikely that a card is going to earn that grade, but if it does, there could be a massive premium there. However, if it doesn't earn that grade, keep in mind there might be less liquidity selling it than there would be with a company like PSA. If you have a card that's Gem Mint, but on the weaker side, maybe due to centering or like one flaw on the backside, a little dot of edgeware, that's when I'd consider PSA or CGC. CGC Pristine 10 still offers a premium and is a bit more achievable than the Black Label 10 of BGS. Having said that, a PSA 9 or a 10 are still very liquid cards and do come with a premium of their own, so those aren't bad options any way you slice it. I would recommend checking the prices and the populations first as you're running this calculation. For cards that are Mint 9 candidates, again, I would recommend going with CGC or PSA. PSA does treat hollow surfaces and dents more harshly, especially for vintage cards and print lines in particular, than CGC does. Something to be aware of. On the other hand, CGC is often more harsh on the edges, as we saw with the Jungle set earlier. Finally, for cards that are on the threshold of gradability, we're talking ones that are near mint plus, I would generally send those to PSA. Cards that are likely going to get a 7 or an 8 are probably going to do better in that PSA grade than they will in their respective BGS or CGC grades. There is one notable exception to this. PSA is extremely hard on cards that have small indentations in them. We're not talking like full-on creases, but just a small dent. Those ones are going to get instantly a 6 at best through PSA, and often those will be graded more favorably through CGC. So just another thing to take into consideration if you're looking to maximize the number on the card itself. Before we wrap up this video, I wanted to talk about how do you know which cards you should grade in the first place? Well, there are usually 4 metrics that I would recommend looking to when making that determination. The first of these is the condition. If your card is below near mint condition, it's generally not worth it to grade unless it's something exceptionally valuable. You should also be aware of populations. Populations often influence the desirability of a card as well as its overall price point. The popularity of the actual Pokemon is also something to take into consideration. Certain cards, certain Pokemon species like Gengar, Pikachu, Dragonite, Umbreon are going to generally do well in comparison to some of the lesser known variants out there. Finally, look up valuations. This is something more people need to do. There are some great tools out there for looking up market trends, researching prices, population data, and a whole lot more. A few of the websites I would personally recommend are for raw cards. Look at TCG Player and eBay. You can look up recently sold listings to see how much your cards are currently worth and if there's going to be any added value to having them graded. For graded cards, you can do the same thing through websites like PokemonPrice.com, PSA, as well as TCGfish and PokeData.io. The last two of these, though, are particularly important and useful, especially to collectors out there that want to get more serious. TCGfish and PokeData each contain sales prices, trends, graphs, as well as abilities to look up population reports and a whole lot more. I can't recommend these enough. I actually did a full video on these sites, and if you want more information on how they work and what type of data and market trends they provide, I'll leave a link to my video down in the description below. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope this information was useful to you all, and if you're just starting out grading, I wish you all the best of luck deciding which cards to send and where to send them to. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. We'll see y'all with the next video. Till then, stay well and have fun. That's what collecting is all about. Bye, everybody.